Rabbi say, tonight we're going to have two parts to the shiur. The second part of the shiur, which is most of the shiur in terms of kamus, is a direct continuation to the shiur of last week. The first half of the shiur, I don't know how you want to categorize it. You want to call it a parenthesis. You want to call it a tangent. It's an insight which is brought in Chassidus a lot, and it adds a lot to the Maamar. But it seems to be like an interruption in terms of Seder, in terms of the order of the Maamar, between what we were learning in the previous class and what we're learning in this class. I played with the idea a little bit of first doing the second part, then doing the first part. It's foolish and unnecessary. Obviously, if the Alter Rebbe did it in this order, he had his reasons for doing it in this order. But I'm just, so to speak, saying this at the outset. We're going to be learning two inyanim, two ideas, both very connected to the theme that our Maamar is discussing. But the first one is going to be sort of like a conclusion of the discussion, and the second one is going to be continuing the discussion, kind of. So just keep that in mind. So here goes, we're going to call the first part of the shiur, if you will. I want to begin by telling a story. The Rebbe the Tzemach Tzedek did not really see children in Yechidas, as a rule. And many of the Rabbeim didn't see children, because Yechidus was a serious thing, and Yechidus was not designed to be social involvement. The Rebbe is involved in people's lives to help them with their problems. Yechidus was designed for Avodas Hashem, like it's described in the Tanya. People went into Yechidus to learn how to serve the Eibishter. So the Rabbeim were meeting people in Yechidus who were serious Evdei Elokim, serious servants of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That the purpose of the going into Yechidus was to advance in Avodas Hashem. There's a story with the Frierdiker Rebbe, where the Frierdiker Rebbe was contemplating stopping Yechidus because nobody was taking it seriously. And he told something to Rabbi Shmuel. So Rabbi Shmuel gathered some Bachrim. He spoke to them in Yonei Avoda, and they went into Yechidus to the Rebbe to speak in Yonei Pnimiyim, the Frierdiker Rebbe. Rabbi Gronos Ozangezun told me that he was one of those Bachrim, and he remembers it. And the Rebbe was very happy. But the Rabbeim, Yechidus was really primarily for Yonei Avoda. But of course, every rule has exceptions, and there were children who had Yechidus by the Tzemach Tzedek, as relevant to this story. One of the children who had Yechidus by the Tzemach Tzedek was the Radatz. The Radatz was Reb David Tzvi Chanin. The Radatz, the Rabbi used to call him Hirshel Derov, Hirshel Chenigever, was a Gon and a Chassid and a Tzaddik, Kipshute, a Tzaddik from Tanya. I love to advertise Sforim of Sipuri Chasidim. There is a wonderful sefer, it's very rich and very full, called Avnei Chaim, which tells the story of what may be the most important family in Chabad outside the Schneur family. The Chain Mishpache is geknippt and gebunden. It's bound up in the history of Lubavitch from the times of the Alter Rebbe until our times. It's a huge, huge Mishpache. And of course, Chain and Lane, for those who don't know, was the same name, and so on. And some of the greatest Chassidim in various generations of Chassidus Chabad were all Chains, were descendants of Kaaretz and so on. The Radatz, of David Tzvi, David Hirsch Chain, was a giant of giants. Like I said before, he was the Madrig of Tzaddik, Posher Kipshute. And his son was Reb Mendel Chain, who was by the Rebbe Rashab, from the greatest. These were incredibly great Goinim, incredibly great Chassidim, incredibly great Evdei Elokim. The Radatz was Zoiche, perhaps in the schus of his father, the Peretz, or whoever, grandfather, the Peretz, I don't know exactly the relationship, to have a yechidus before bar mitzvah, which is uncharacteristic. So he came into the Tzemach Tzedek, and it's brought, the story is brought in the Likutei Torah, and the Sichas of the Frierdiker Rebbe, and the Tzemach Tzedek told him, amongst other things, Ver ois ingel. Stop being a child. Adu v'zogen Baruch Atah. When you say a bracha, and you say Baruch Atah, Hashem Elokeinu, Melech Haolam, and so on, so the word Atah means you. And when you say you mean do Atzmus Amos Ein Tzav Baruch Hu, like the Alter Rebbe says, Veistach. Atah harei soladas, do Atzmus Amos hat sich ba'wissen. As men soll dir wissen. Atah means you. So the word Atah, it's not a Shem Kaddish, it's not the name of the Eibishter, but it's a direct conversation. It's a first and second person involvement with Hashem. You say, blessed are you. You. So the Tzemach Tzedek said, when you say Baruch Atah, you should remember who Atah is. The Radatz, as a child, was obviously a special child, an extraordinary child. He took this on face value. And from that moment forward, for the remainder of his life, and he lived a very long time, lived well into his 80s. Pardon me. Every time he made a bracha, he would put his head on his forehead, and he would think, and then he'd make the bracha. Baruch Atah. Making a bracha like that, certainly I was never zeicher to see a Yid who every single time makes a bracha would have that kind of achon. I heard that by Reb Shmuel Levitten, when he made a bracha, every bracha was a situation. Mistama by Reb Nissen, but I was old enough, but I don't remember either of these chassidim. But the Radatz was a Yid, every time he made a bracha, he would put his hand on his head and think. He was thinking what the Tzemach Tzedek told him, who Atah is, you, the Eibishter himself. Baruch Atah. And of course, the end of the story is that many, many years later, he was a big Rav in a big city in Chernigiv. And I'm not sure exactly how this works out, but his father had been the Rav in Chernigiv, and he became the Rav in Chernigiv when his father was still alive. His father went, I think, to Neville at the end of his life. I don't remember, but he became the Rav in Chernigiv for many, many years. And the Tsar, the Kaiser, the Tsar of Russia came to Chernigiv. And as the minig Atik was, that when the king would come, the community would come out to greet him. In the olden days, they used to come out with a Sefer Torah. And then there was an event that happened. They stopped coming out with a Sefer Torah. And the delegation, the Jews would meet the king, as all people would. And at the head of the delegation, or the people would meet the king, were the leaders, the prominent members of the community, including the Rav and so on. And the Radatz was standing at the head of the delegation. There's pictures of him. Take a look at his photo, and he looks feierdik. He looks flam fire. Rabbi Jacobson, Rabbi Sol Jacobson, in his book Zikaron of Neisol. And Rabbi Jacobson is not a man who throws compliments around at all. Said that he had the schus to listen through a crack in a door. Lo oisei chosid v'oisei tzaddik. When Rabbi Jacobson called him a tzaddik. If you've read his autobiography, you see how precise his assessment of people are, but he calls him Matzadik. And you read the Sefer Avnei Chen, you get an idea of what kind of man he was. And the Radatz was the head of this delegation, and the king came by, and you have to make a bracha. So he did his meditation, he started making the bracha. He'd never made the bracha, this bracha in his life before, so he became so excited he started screaming. Of course, nobody knows what he's screaming, so the police arrested him. They blocked him up. He's disrespecting the king, and they had to explain that this was a symptom of the kavod of the melech. I made a bracha. And the bracha elicited within him such incredible attractions that he became emotional, started screaming. There's a story which is brought in this Sefer Avnei Chen about the Radatz, which is a shposhta geschmacka maise, that he would stand in shul and daven. This was a Rav. So people came to him with shaylis, he had to deal with all kinds of community affairs, and after he finished all those things, he would lock himself in the shul. The shul was locked. He would lock himself in, he would stand and daven bam bimah by himself, and people would look through the window. And one time, he was standing by the bimah, and he fell down on the ground, but he just fell back, I think, from his rakshas. He was davening, he fell on the floor, and he locked himself into the shul, they had to break the door to go in to help him. So when this event reached the Rebbe Rashab said, The Rebbe, a guy should fall to the ground from Avodas Atfilah, then like the Alter Rebbe. Rebbe Rashab said, I thought he has a greater head, he can keep himself, he can hold himself more. These are very big people. It's a whole nother level. But the point is that Adat made a bracha. It was a shturim. So there's a story that goes like this, and I'm not going to tell you all the Pratei Asiba, I'm just going to tell you certain parts of the story. That the Radatz had a son who was Reb Mendel Chaim. When you read about these people and you see their relationships to the Rabbeim, you're awed. You're awed. The Reb Mendel Chaim used to write that the Rebbe Rashab, Avdei, his servant, his slave, who stands to serve the Rebbe Rashab at every hour. Reb Mendel Chaim was killed al Kiddush Hashem. Meisa nefesh, limsa nefesh al Kiddush Hashem. Emes al Kiddush Hashem barabim. And they needed a shidduch for Reb Mendel Chaim. And there was a certain Gadol B'Yisrael, a real Gadol B'Yisrael, who wanted him for a son-in-law. So the Radat sent one of his daughters to this Gadol B'Yisrael to see if the paske shidduch, if it's appropriate. So when she came back, the Radat says, "No, what do you think of the possible shidduch?" So she said, "Tata, as daina shayotzer the shene ve'zayin ganze davne." He said, when you say a Asha Yotzar, there's more avoid in your Asha Yotzar than in his davening. And the shidduch never happened. And he ended up marrying the daughter of Rabbi Hoffman. Rabbi Hoffman was a chassid of the Rebbe Marasha, the Rebbe Rashab. He was a Makubal. He's called a Makubal, and I think he's even called the last of the Makubal. When I grace a chassid, and there's harichas in the Rebbe's Rishimis, which were published after Gimel Tammuz, there's some very special things about the Rabbi Hoffman, which were not printed in the Siches, where the Friedrich Rebbe shared with our Rebbe what happened with Rabbi Hoffman before he passed. It's not for now. Now, the first thing is I told you a story, and Leiha Medrish Yekirela Maise story, everybody remembers. But I'm telling the story to make a point. The point is, what are brachas? What are brachas? You make a bracha and you say barach atah, you should have in mind kach v'kach. What are brachas? So of course there's different types of brachas. Shmenesre is brachas. Shmenesre is brachas. Shmenesre is brachas because the whole Shmenesre is tefillah davnen. But most brachas are really a support for something else. You want to eat food, you make a bracha. You want to do a mitzvah, you make a bracha. That's what the vast majority of brachas are. Brachas are done in preparation before, in the Lashon HaGemara, Eiver Lasayas. As you'll see in the Shir, and you see soon inside, before you do a mitzvah, you make a bracha. Before you eat food, you make a bracha. Pardon me. So, of course, in the Torah you have V'yachalta v'savato v'erachta. There's a mitzvah say to bench grace after meals. But all brachas, besides for Birchas HaMazain, and maybe Birchas HaTeira, are the Rabbanan. Who invented brachas? Who invented brachas? David HaMelech invented brachas. It's one of the Sheva mitzvahs the Rabbanan, right? Na b'simcha, one of the 7 mitzvahs the Rabbanan. Na b'simcha. The Rebbe has a footnote. Nun ayin beis shid memchas hey represents all the 7 brachas the Rabbanan, mitzvahs the Rabbanan, and the beis of b'simcha is for brachas. And David HaMelech instituted the people should say brachas, and he even instituted that, and this we have of course in the Marich Chassidus Barichas, that he should say meya brachas b'chol yom, say 100 brachas a day. So for 400 years Yidden did mitzvahs, there was no bracha. Yidden ate food, they didn't make a bracha before, they only made a bracha after if they ate a meal, like a Birchas HaMazain, v'chalto v'savato v'erachta. Why did David institute brachas? So it says in the Gemara, and it's brought in the Maamar Chassidus on Va'atom Yisrael Mo'avai Lekech Hashem Imachim Liira Tikra Mo Ala Meya. This goes on the Meya Bracha that a person says every day. This is a Gemara. Because there was Magefa, people were dying, and David didn't know how to stop it, so he asked Milmaila, and he made brachas. So when you listen to this story, and you understand that when the Jewish people were born as a nation, they did mitzvahs. But you didn't have what's called a Birchas HaMitzvah. Before you do a mitzvah, they didn't say Sheket Shonim Mitzvah V'Tzivanu, Al Natilas Yadoyim, Sheket Shonim Mitzvah V'Tzivanu, L'satef batzitzis, shekadishanim b'tzitzivanu, laniach tefillin, al mitzvahs tefillin. And then when you ate food, you didn't have a shahakal and a mezenis and ha'etz and a hadama and so forth. 400 years or so into the history of the Jewish people, David instituted brachas because there was some kind of magif. Now, without giving you the whole long spiel about brachas, because this is not our topic, this is a topic for Parshas Eikev, right? I'm thinking about Meya. And I'm actually planning a mitzvah Hashem when we're going to go to Teda Eir. During the winter, we're going to learn the Maim from the Alter Rebbe. My plan is, B'li Neder, to learn the Maim Etake L'Hav Ninyan HaBrachas. And over there, perhaps we'll discuss it at more length. But here, I'm just mentioning it. Why for 400 years were there no brachas? And then people started to die, and David couldn't figure out why they were dying, and then he instituted brachas, and 100 brachas a day, and then people stopped to die. So the answer, without giving away the whole story, is because Yidden were obviously on a lower level. And because they're on a lower level, doing a mitzvah without a bracha was lacking. Eating food, not making a bracha before, was lacking. And before that time, Yidden were on a higher level, and they did a mitzvah, there was no bracha, and whatever the bracha achieved was achieved to the mitzvah itself. Yidden ate food, did not make a bracha rishena, and you didn't say then that Vista Kolonena, Be'el Mazam, Be'el Bracha, Kilin, Nene, Mekotche Shamayim. You ate food, and without making a bracha, it was not considered Me'el Behektish. Eating it alone was holy. In the times of David HaMelech, it became necessary to add something else. In other words, Yidden were on a lower level, and because Yidden were on a lower level, they needed something to counteract, to balance out the fact that they were on lower Madrega, and that's they had Me'er Brachas. But of course, every person who's learned any Chassidus knows that any time there is a takana, an enactment made, and in this case it's not like the Gzeirus as Man Bayis Sheni, it's actually one of the Sheva mitzvahs that Rabbanan, in the times of Bayis Rishon, before Bayis Rishon yet. You make a takana because Yidden are on a lower level, and to counteract the fact Yidden on a lower level, they need more. So you add a bracha, so you have to always say that there's a silver lining. In other words, it's an idea of Yerida Tzerech Alei. Jews are on a lower level, so a mitzvah by itself is not enough. Eating food without a bracha before is not enough. You have to make a bracha also. So the bracha reflects you need more because you're on a lower level, but you must say that once the bracha is instituted, it actually adds something more than without the bracha. Or to say it in other words, once David HaMelech instituted brachas, the Yidden who lived in the generations before him, who didn't have brachas, because they didn't need brachas, would also have achieved more had they had brachas. Or when Mashiach is going to come and Tchias HaMesim is going to happen, and they're all going to become a Matchia, then they're not going to say we don't need brachas because in our times there were no brachas. They're going to say brachas because there's going to be a mile in brachas even for them. And this is what Chassidus discusses on this topic of Atikra Ma'ala Meya. That if you can't do Ma, which is a higher level, do Meya brachas, which is a much lower level. But then we say that Meya brachas means that you're bringing the Aleph into Ma. In other words, it may be that because you're on a lower level, you need a bracha, but once you have the bracha achieves more than the non-bracha. Why am I saying this? Because we're learning a Maamar that discusses you need to say the Chaliyah. The neshama before it comes into this world is called Kadosh, a holy soul. And the neshama has a Yerida Tzei Chaliyah. It goes down, not to go up. And what is it going up to? It's going from the level of Kadosh to the level of Kodesh. In other words, they're going from the level of holiness in relationship to something, to the thing of holiness itself. So the Rebbe says, let's go straight into the text, line 82, V'hine. Gile b'chinazu. The idea that the neshama comes on into this world with all of its challenges. And we say that there's a phenomena of Yerida, Tzerech Aliyah, the neshama is descending in order to propel itself forward. That's going from the level of Kadesh, the way holiness is in Hishtalshlos. Holiness is connected to things, to Kodesh, the holiness as it is by itself. Says the Rabbi, you should know the experience of the Kodesh, which we affect through the Yerida, Tzerech Aliyah, the neshama coming into this goof, is going to be Asher Mashiach comes Asad Lovi. regarding which it is written, Ayin Leirasa, the game, and no one has ever seen it. And we talked about this Ayin Leirasa in the very first shiur on the Maamar when we had our conversations about basically the different shittas, about Yemei Mashiach and Elam Haba. I don't want to go over it again. We discussed it at length, actually, in that first shiur. So the Kodesh, which is higher than the Kodesh, is accomplished now by the Torah and mitzvah do in this world, but it's going to be experienced when Mashiach comes. Currently, now it's hidden in the mitzvahs that we perform. Why? Because the madreg of Kodesh is very high. In fact, the Rebbe proposed that madreg of Kodesh is so high we shouldn't be able to tolerate it altogether. And he has to explain how we're able to, so to speak, handle the madreg of Kodesh without it being, if you will, a destructive force. Okay? But the revelation of the Kodesh is going to be Liadi. Says the Rebbe, now he changes it around. I'm in the middle of line 83. But you should know that Ktsas, Gilim, and Bechinazu, a little bit of this revelation, Nimshach, is brought down, Lahoyer lenefesh ha'adam, Ba'aveda, to radiate, to illuminate the soul of a person in the Vedas Hashem, Ha'adam bebechinas kedusha, a little bit of this holiness. In other words, even though the full experience of this holiness, of Kodesh, is not going to be experienced until Lasad Lavi, whatever Lasad Lavi means, but Pashas it means Yemei Mashiach in this Maamar, but I don't know. A little bit we have now. And then he says on line 86, V'zehu inyan brechas ha-mitzvahs. But the access to that holiness is not connected to the mitzvah we do, but the bracha that we do along with the mitzvah. In other words, it may be true that the origin of brachas is a symptom of a chassan. For 400 years, Jewish people did mitzvahs without brachas. And then David HaMelech saw that there was kach v'kach, so he instituted brachas and meya brachas to offset that negativity. And since that time, people do brachas, brachas hanenin, brachas ha-mitzvahs, and so on. So when we do a mitzvah, you make a bracha. So even if it's true that the original reason for instituting brachas was because of a chassarin, you should know that the bracha has a maila. What's the maila? That it causes a little bit of the revelation of Kodesh. Holiness as it is by itself, which is higher than holiness in conjunction with a thing. Kodesh, which is higher than Kadosh, is felt a little bit, not from the mitzvah. From the bracha that comes along with the mitzvah. Now think about it. The mitzvah is from the Eibishter. The bracha is Medivrei Seifrim. It's one of the 7 mitzvahs that Rabbanan. So it's obviously on a lower level. But Chassidus explains that the Divrei Seifrim bracha, which is on a lower level, has a higher source than the De'eraisa. And what is the reward? What is the benefit of the bracha? And its higher source. The De'eraisa says that whatever godliness you create in the higher worlds should not stay on high, it should be drawn down lamata. In other words, the Jews in the first few hundred years of history did mitzvahs. They didn't make brachas. There was no chassarin. They were in tune with alakus on a very, very high level. Did they necessarily reveal the madreg of Kodesh themselves? Perhaps not, but they were not lacking anything because of their ma, because of their bittul. And when brachas were instituted, so besides for the yerida, the negative reason brachas were necessary, it gives an advantage that we could experience, we could feel the Kodesh a little bit. And he explains it in the word bracha. What's the lashon of a bracha? We say that Hashem made us holy with our mitzvahs, and we talked about this in the previous year. And what did we say? That through a mitzvah, a yid is kaddish, a yid is Tanya Perek Mavav, Perek Mem Zayin, a yid is separated from all other creations. Pardon me, but not only is it true that through a mitzvah, a yid is separate from all other creations, but it's also true that through a mitzvah, a yid experiences the holiness of his separation from Hashem. It's not only that they were removed from everybody else through the mitzvah, but we have a little bit of a feel of the holiness of this separation which mitzvahs give us. And he Pasha translates a bracha. And he goes through each word separately. That's the meaning of the word baruch. Baruch means to draw down. From the level of godliness which is called atzmos. That means godliness as it exists in relationship with itself, which is in general the madrega of Kodesh. Holiness by itself, as opposed to madrega of Kodesh, holiness in conjunction with somebody else. It should be radiating, it should shine, it should be drawn down. So Baruch means to bring down. And then we say, Achia Bechinas, Ata L'Necha. How available does godliness become when you do a mitzvah, and that before you do the mitzvah, as you see soon, you make a bracha, that the godliness of Atzmas Amus becomes Ata, straight to your face. You say you to a person who's directly in front of you. The idea that the Eibishter is standing in front of a Yid, to the extent that Yid can refer to him as you, is a very high level of sensitivity to the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So a mitzvah reveals a high level of Kaddish, but it's hidden. Kaddish, but it's hidden. And the bracha brings it to the person to the extent that a Yid can tell Hashem, Ata, you, first person, or second person. And then he says, V'amshachazu hi aidei shem avaya. Baruch, you draw down the lakus level of Ata, and the idea that godliness reaches you on a level, we call it Ata, is through the Eibishter's name Avaya, which of course reveals a lakus. The word Avaya means to reveal. So in this Maimed, it's not the pshat that Ata is the higher level and Avaya is the lower level, that Elkein is the lower level still, but that Havaya facilitates the Ata. The idea that a Yid should be so intimate, so connected to the Atzmus of Elokus, to the highest Madregis, Havaya reveals this Atzmus which is called Ata. And then it says, where he skips the Elkein and goes straight to Melech Elam. Ubechinas Melech Elam. You reveal through a bracha, which you do with a mitzvah. The mitzvah reveals, the mitzvah reveals Kedesh, which is higher than Kaddish. But that's going to be revealed Liyasid Lavi. The bracha that comes along with the mitzvah, which is secondary to the mitzvah, and it's midrabanan and so on, but it reveals even now a little bit of that godliness. And then he says, what's the Taich Melech Elam? That this godliness comes down to be involved in the world at large. Kibi das malchus, the measure of malchus is Makar Elam, is the source of all of the worlds. And when you call the Eibush the Melech Elam, that means you're involving the Eibush not just in the world of Atzilus, but in the lower worlds as well. U'mislab, and this is how a lakus comes down into Zman and Makam, time and space, like it says in Siddur, and it's brought in Sharichim in the beginning, Perek Zayin, Melech, Malach, and Yimlech, V'cholu, that the Eibush, as he's a king, is connected to time and connected to space. And we call him Malchus Chamalchus, Kol Olam, his kingship is the kingship of all of the worlds. In other words, Eibush has kingship of all kingships in the lower worlds and every generation, day by day. So a bracha, says the Alter Rebbe, which is an invention of David HaMelech, it's a derabanan, it's not part of the Yiddishkeit that the Eibishter gave us, doesn't change the effect of a mitzvah, but it causes that the effect of a mitzvah should be revealed a little bit on the level of Baruch Atah, to reveal in a way of you directness, with the help of Havaya until Melech Elam. But you see, Melech Elam means Eibishter is the king over the world. In as much as Eibishter is king over the world, what are we? We're his subjects. Says the Rebbe Lekach, and therefore our response to a mitzvah with a bracha is Kabbalah Sel Machashamayim. Could you do a mitzvah? You say Baruch Atah D'Shem Melech Ha'elam, and in saying Baruch Atah D'Shem Melech Ha'elam, you are bringing the godliness which is face to face with you to be the king over the worlds. If the Eibush is the king, we have to be his subject. So we respond to the bracha with the Kabbalah Sel. And then Yumshach Gili B'Chuy Nezuba Nefesh, this revelation reaches the neshama a little bit. You should experience the kedusha in a mitzvah. So to be sure, the true revelation of Ein Sof, of Atzmas and Face, of Kedesh Yibim and Mashiach comes Lazar Love. But a little bit we experience it because when we do a mitzvah, we also make a bracha, and the bracha that we make is hamshach. So bracha that you only made the Rabbanon have a special koyach. That when you do a mitzvah, before you did the mitzvah, you made the bracha that whatever it is that the mitzvah is achieving is brought to you and revealed to you through the bracha. Check. Now line 95, once we understand the concept of brachas as we just described them, there's another concept. Omar says in the Gemara that kol brachas kulam avarach alein evel asiyas, which means the bracha has to be done before the mitzvah. You can't be by the chometz and after the end of the particular chometz you could say Shechid Shalom and say Tzivanu I'll be your chometz. You can't do any other mitzvah. After the mitzvah is finished, now you make a bracha. The bracha has to be before. But ve'ever, this lashon evel asiyas means has to be before the action. Has to go ahead of the action. That's what ever means. Has to go ahead of the action. So the chap, of course, is the ma'aseh is midiraisa. The mitzvah is midiraisa. The bracha is all midirabana. And nevertheless, the dirabana come before the diraisa. Ever that passes over the asiyah, which is midiraisa. So the Rabbi says two things. Number one, ever lishne dagdumehu. Eva means chronological precedence. The bracha, which is in a lower level than the mitzvah, comes before the mitzvah in time. And gam Eva lashon makif. In addition, the word Eva means that it's above, transcendent, beyond, hidden. And Eva Lasyasan means the mitzvah is a very high level of godliness, but the bracha is Eva is an even higher level of godliness, which cannot be revealed. Kame Eva Laseicher, like you have in Pasuk Eva Laseicher, and the word Seicher goes on Lashon Scher, which is Makif, and Amshichat Chil B'chin is Makif, She Makif Lasyasan, and Sein Alema Lamaisa Mitchol Eva Laseicher means higher than the Madrega of Seicher. Seicher means the Madrega of Makif. So he translates, he uses the words Eiver Laseicher to explain the word Oiver in this case, that Oiver means that the godliness which the bracha reveals is called the Madrega of Makif. So once we establish the inyan of brachas, and we explain that when Yid makes a bracha, he affects that the godliness, the godly change, the godly improvement which happens in the world is revealed a little bit. Then he says the bracha has to come before the mitzvah. Key, line 98, because ha-mitzvah is the physical mitzvah, which is takamamshach atzmus, kedish, but it's connected to a physical thing, like film, like the physical wool of a towel, like physical leather of tefillin. In order for the light of holiness, which is on high, supernal, to manifest in the physical thing, you can't just do the mitzvah, you have to have a preparation. And the preparation has to come first to set it up. So mitzvah is a davar gashmi. In gashmi you have atzmus, as the Rebbe would say it. But because it's a gashmi, the atzmus is behelim, you do something before which affects that you should experience in the mitzvah lakus. Vehu bebirchas ha-mitzvah, this is in the bracha, which is mamshich bebechinas makif amayis ha-mitzvah chul. The bracha brings down the brachas of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and brings the madrega of makif, of save of kolam. V'zehu, and this is the pshat lishna dagduma, the Eiver Laseicher means that the bracha comes before the mitzvah, that even though the mitzvah is the Reis and the brachas, but the Rabbanan nevertheless the bracha comes first. Lahamshich bechinas makif, Lasa Yossi, to bring the highest levels of godliness which is hidden from us into an action, Mereish Kol dying for the highest levels, Li is Barach v'nimshach melech elm, to be blessed and brought down into the kingship of the world. To bring down the light of Kedesh Aliyah itself, Gamba b'chinas pnimius in an internal way, they might say mitzvah, doing a mitzvah. So when you do a mitzvah, after you make a bracha, the godliness of the mitzvah could be revealed inside the person. Now the Rebbe concludes, and this conclusion really does not go to this page about Birchas HaMitzvah, because the Birchas HaMitzvah seems to be a tangent, because he's speaking about the Inyan HaBrachas. And now on line 105 he goes back to the Maamar proper. Yuvan Inyan Yidis HaNeshama Sheterach Li, the Neshama descends to go higher. Hagam Shagam Metchila, Ola B'machshav, even though Neshama is on the level of thought, as we discussed in the last year, the highest madregis of thought. Through coming into this world, they're going to go even higher. And the level of holiness which is removed from the world, it's holiness which is removed from anything else, it's holiness by itself. As opposed to machshava, which is as opposed to the lower madrege, which only gets a ha'ara of that. So this is how you need the terech aliyah. The neshama comes into this world, it does mitzvahs, and it can go from the level of kedusha, which is a much lower level, to the level of Kedesh, which is a much higher madrega. So this is the first part of today's shir, where the Alter Rebbe in a few lines discusses that the Yerida Tzerech Aliyah reveals Atzmut, which is going to be only Liyasat Lave, and a little bit you experience, but because of Birchas HaMitzvahs. And again, I want to begin with a story, but it's really a contrast between two stories that Tzricha Limud, that I want to study, but it's very, very important that we appreciate the stories correctly. The Rebbe Rashab, there's a sefer called Teras Shalom, Sefer HaSichas Teras Shalom, which is the Sichas of the Rebbe Rashab, which our Rebbe was very fakocht in. The Rebbe loved it. The Rebbe was so involved in the Teras Shalom. He typed it himself, Pashut, on a typewriter, and sold it, and then later he had a typeset. And in the Sefer Torah Shalom, Rubam Kukulam, the majority of those sichos, the vast majority of those sichos, were actually written by the Frierdiker Rebbe himself. Some were written Hanochas by Chassidim, by Talmidim, and so on. But most of them are from the Frierdiker Rebbe's own Hanochas. And there's some very, it's very deep avoided the kesugis, but there's some very, very interesting things there as well. I think there's a Chavdala Tevis, maybe Samach Zayin, where the Rebbe Rashab was mafli the Alter Rebbe. He spoke about the Alter Rebbe, Gedelis and Itzuris. I mean, one of the famous verte that we know from the Rebbe Rashab that he said about the Alter Rebbe, that he was higher than Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Because Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said, "Any day, Beis Derech Melichina." He said, "He doesn't know if I'm going to Gan Eden or to Gehenna." And the Alter Rebbe said to his Chassidim that they should take advantage of him now, because after he passes away, wird man dem Klammke zu mein Tiering Gan Eden det kennen treffen. Pardon me. You won't be able to find the knob to my door in Gan Eden. So the Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai doesn't know, and the Alter Rebbe says he knows where he's going to such an extent that his Chassidim, and the Chassidim of the Alter Rebbe were G'deilim, would not be able to find the handle to his door in Gan Eden. Anyway, so in this Rishim, one of the Rishimis, the Rebbe Rashab spoke about the Alter Rebbe. And he said about the Alter Rebbe, the Frierdiker seine nicht gewähnt größer von him. The Tzadikim, the Gedolim from earlier generations were not greater than him. Had he been in the time of the Rishonim, it would have been a Rishon. Had he been in the time of the Go'onim, it would have been a Gon. Had he been in the time of the Ameroim, it would have been an Ameira. Had he been in the time of the Tanoim, it would have been a Tana. And he said, had he been in the time of the Nevi'im, it would have been a Navi. And then he said, I don't want to go higher. So upon him, this higher Madregas. And then the Rebbe concluded, the generation, so to speak, held him back. Whatever this means. But the Rebbe Rashab said about the Alter Rebbe that he lived much later than the great neshamis of the Zman HaShas and the Man Beis HaMikdash. But to him it didn't make a difference. The Frierdiker that nicht gewähnt größer for him. The ones who were before him were no greater than he was equal to them. This is a word that the Rebbe Rashab said about the Alter Rebbe. And of course there's two parts to it. The first part of it is this initial statement, that those that came before him were not greater than he was, which is what we want to focus on tonight. And the other is, that the generation did not allow him to achieve certain madreges. This, I don't know exactly what it means, but it's not part of what's negated to us. Then there's another word, which is in Yankel Landau's Rishimis. Yankel Landau was a big Rav in Bnei Brak. He was a Gon and a Chassid. And he was a Talmud in Temchat Mimim. He was very close to the Rebbe Rashab. He was a Rav in the house, and so on and so forth. And Yankel Landau used to write our Rebbe, the Rishimis, Zechrenis, that he would remember. And they've been published in a sefer called Shmuas V'Sipurim Chelik Aleph, that from Father Khan, that his son-in-law, Rabbi Yitzchak Gansberg, Alav Shalom, reprinted. And at the back of Chelik Aleph, he put in a little section, Yankel Landau's Rishimis, to the Rebbe Rashab. They're printed there. And one of the stories that's written there is the following story. Yankel Landau was still a bocher. And he was in the house, so he sat by the table, by the Rebbe Rashab am Tish. But the Rebbe Rashab never gave him the cost to bench. He always had a minion, the 10 Yidden sitting by the table. And the Rebbe Rashab would either bench himself, Birchas HaMazon, or would give it to somebody else to bench. The Rebbe never gave it to Yankel Landau, never. He was a bocher. One time, there was a discussion between the Rebbe Rashab and Rabbi Yankel Landau on a Shabbos morning, let's say, where the Rebbe Rashab said to Yankel Landau that Heintain Neton Neshamas Datzilas. Nowadays there's no more Neshamas of Atzilas. So Yankel Landau couldn't listen to the Rebbe Rashab say that there's no Neshamas of Atzilas. He was a Chassid, so a Makusher. And in his mind there was no question that the Rebbe Rashab himself was a Neshama of Atzilas. So Rabbi Yankel Landau says to the Rebbe Rashab respectfully, Aber Rebbe Heintain Eichtan Neshamas Datzilas. But the Rebbe, today there are also neshamas of Atzilas. And the Rebbe Rashab answered him, and Atzilas are neichad madreges. There's levels in Atzilas. Meaning to say, he didn't disagree with Yankel Landau when Yankel Landau asserted that Heinz and Eichad neshamas of Atzilas. It's true. Meaning he was admitting that the Rebbe is a neshama of Atzilas. Heinz and Atzilas da madreges. So Yankel Landau said that Shabbos, the Rebbe Rashab gave him the bacher to bench. And he led the benching. And the way he understood it, then of course, to appreciate this kind of a gesture, you have to know the Rebbe Rashab, which we don't know. He knew him. And he writes to the Rebbe that he understood that the reason the Rebbe Rashab gave him the bach at the bench, because he was thanking him, was giving him a yashakech for arguing with him. That when he said there's no neshamas of Atzilus, and Yankelanda said, "Aber Rebbe Heinz an echta neshamas of Atzilus." Today there's also neshamas of Atzilus. This was a yashakech for having said it. And then, of course, the Rebbe Rashab's response was, "It's true. There are neshamas of Atzilus, aber Atzilus an echta madregis." Now, I'm going to say this now, in my humble opinion. When the Rebbe Rashab said in Atzilus echta madregis, it's an even anivis. In other words, the emphasis is that the Rebbe Rashab was in neshama of Atzilus, the highest madregas of Atzilus, and there's something to talk about. But this is what he said. In Atzilus is echad madregas. In other words, Chachafil, the Rebbe Rashab, appreciated the fact that Rabbi Yankov Landau insisted that he's a neshama of Atzilus, but he retorted in Atzilus is echad madregas, and but I believe that the Rebbe Rashab said also only mitzad anivis, and in Amitis Yonim, the Rebbe Rashab is neshama of Atzilus, the highest madregas of Atzilus. And I'll tell you a word, stam derech agav, which is very gishmak about the Rebbe Rashab, that there were the two great chassidim of the Tzemach Tzedek, who were by the Rebbe Rashab. One was the Taked Radatz that I mentioned before, and the other was Rabbi Gershon Ber Paharer. They were the Chshuvei Talmidim by the Tzemach Tzedek. And they had an argument, and there's in Yisrael Jacobson's Reshibis, there's also a word about Greinim and the Mashgiach, the Meshke, I can't remember his name, Meshke Zembiner, about the Rebbe Rashab. It's printed in the Yisrael Jacobson's Reshibis, a very passionate machlokes. But anyway, Rabbi Gershon Ber and the Radatz had an argument. They were by the Tzemach Tzedek. And of course, their madrichim, their mashpiyim, were chassidim tak of the Alter Rebbe, or the Middle Rebbe, Rebbe Hillel, or the Pesach Malostovke. And the argument was the Rebbe Rashab is taka Rebbe, but is he as great as the Alter Rebbe? So Rabbi Gershon Ber used to say that the Rebbe Rashab is as great as the Alter Rebbe. And the Radatz used to say er taka grois, aber nicht as the Alter Rebbe. That's what it is. The Radatz passed away in Eretz Yisrael in Pesach 1927, and he also had Arichas Yom. He lived very long. He lived much longer than the Rabbi Gershon Ber. When he was on his deathbed, on his Eretz Devoy, he was dying. He said, wo is Gershon Ber? Ich will ihm sagen, er ist gewinn gerecht. That's the word. Where is Gershon Ber? In other words, he was writing Elam Emes. I want to tell him he was right when he said that the Rebbe Rashab is Shaveh with the Alter Rebbe. So putting that Nivis aside, I want to just study the Werter. Here you have the Rebbe Rashab saying two things. Number one, he says about the Alter Rebbe, the Friedik is eine nicht gewinn größer for him. There's certain tzaddikim, the ones from earlier generations, no greater than he was. And then there's another statement, but a different tzaddik, and Atzilus says echad madregas. What's the point? The point is that there's a lot of levels in holy. There's a lot of levels in holy. And the neshamas from earlier generations were undoubtedly greater than the neshamas from later generations. There's no question about it. Because we are Gilgulim and Nitzutzim of the earlier generations. The neshamas, the Gemara's Lashon, and Marishenim, Kimalachim, Anukim Neyadnim, Ashenikim Neyadnim, Anukim Chamedim, Velekeh Chamedim, Shapechets. There's no question there's Yeridas Haderes. But even though there's Yeridas Haderes, every generation has tzaddikim. But when you say that in every generation has tzaddikim, in tzaddikim itself, there's two levels. One level of tzaddik is the friedik as a nid geven grasa farami, such a madrege, that wherever you put him, he'll be the greatest of the great in that time. In other words, by him there's no yeridas haderis whatsoever. There's no gilgul neshamas. And then there's the madrege, but in neshamas of Atzilus is eched al madreges. The taked is in every der there's tzaddikim, der v'der shav, der manhigov. But the tzaddikim on a lower level. Why am I giving you this as an introduction? Because this is the conversation from the previous shir. Kodesh and Kadosh. The difference between the word Kodesh and Kadosh is the thing of holiness. Kadosh is how holiness is manifest on something. In other words, Kodesh is the noun of the idea of something being holy. Kadosh is the application of holiness to something. You have a holy table, a holy chair, a holy sefer. That's holiness in conjunction with a thing. Versus Kodesh, the thing of holiness itself. And of course the nimshal is, Kadosh with a vav is considered a ha'ara. It's much lower than Kodesh as it is by itself. So in these two tiurim, in these two expressions, the Friedik as an nishgev and grasser for him, and in Atzilus as Eichet or Madregis, you have these two concepts. The Friedik as a nishgev means is a person who's holy. But the level of his holiness is not holiness in relationship with. He is the thing of holiness. If one is the thing of holiness, wherever you're going to be that holy, because it's an absolute definition. On the other hand, if you say holiness in relationship with something, there are madregas. So the Rebbe told us in the sheet of last week that a neshama is Kodesh, right? What I tell you, Beide Kadeshim, Yetzim Misharsim, and Shem Misharsim. Malachim are called Misharsim, and the Neshamas are called Kadeshim. Neshamas are called holy. But the neshama, the way the neshama is holy, is that they're holy on a level. In holiness, there are levels. And the Yerid, Tzerech Aliyah, is to go from the Madrega of Kadosh. In Heiligkeit, there's no Madregas, to the Madrega of Kodesh. It's an absolute criteria. So I gave you these two stories. So again, as I said in the beginning of the year, the Vailat Atmanag Chapta Maise Chassidishe Parsha, which is Leha Medre Shekirela Maise. But it helps illustrate what we were discussing in the previous shir, that when a neshama comes into this world, the neshama is naturally in a state of kadosh. By coming into this world, he achieves a level of kodesh. Instead of the neshama being holy in a certain context, on a certain level, in a certain framework, and with certain relationships, the neshama becomes the absolute thing of holiness, which means that the holiness is going to be the same everywhere. So the question now becomes, the neshama in Gan Eden is kadosh. The neshama comes into this world and achieves kodesh. How? This world is not only not kodesh, the world is not only not kodesh, the world is not even tar. The world is tamei, right? Gazru al gushav al avira chutz la'aretz is tamei. It's asiyah, it's klipa. Don't ask. So the question now is, this argument of yerida tzerech aliyah, you go from kadosh, which is in Gan Eden, you go down into this world and you achieve kodesh, which is yerida tzerech aliyah, dafka from this world. How does that happen? So we begin Sif Beis, which is line 109. V'hine al gilui shayidei ma'aseh mitzvahs. The idea that becoming out into this world and doing mitzvahs, you have a yerida tzerech aliyah from the madrega of kadosh, from holiness on a level, from the madrega of kodesh, the thing of holiness. And here the Rebbe adds the word gilui that is revealed. The way it's understood is based on the pasuk on which this Maamar is built. Nema, the pasuk says, Ki ka'aretz teitzi tzmecha ukegana zeiru'eha tatzmiach. That the reason, dafke and asiyah, there's a yerida tzerech aliyah, the madrega of kodesh, is because on this earth there's a phenomena of harvest. You plant, and things grow, and you harvest them. This illustration of planting and harvesting and things growing, it justifies, it explains this yerida tzerech aliyah. Key, let's explain. Love, and the question, of course, is Eichai de Asiyah Gashmi, is the Ma'aseh Mitzvahs. You come into a physical world which is the enemy of Kedusha, right? Rubik kulei ra, rak ma'at me'ed, mu'urav b'seicha. It's called Mishcha de Chivyu Elam Hades, Klippas von aller Seiten. Nevertheless, when you do mitzvahs begashmias, Yis'alu bebechinas kedesh elin mamash, a yid achieves a level of holiness which is not subjective, which is not relative, it's absolute, which is madrega of chokhmah, shalamayla meyashtalshas v'chulu, which is a ba'oltra above ishtalshas. So how does that work? Yeah, how does that work? How does that work? How in this physical world, doing physical mitzvahs, do you have an aliyah? Achin yalzeh number mitzvahs. The answer to this question was written by mitzvahs ziru loshen ziriyah, to plant ziru lachem l'tzedakah v'chulu zirei tzedakah just meichashos. When a yid does a mitzvah, he's planting seeds. Every time you do a mitzvah, you're planting a seed. You have an Igeres HaKedesh also, without Rebbe talks about tzedakah. When you do a mitzvah, you're planting a seed. And of course, when you plant a seed, it grows. And there's two concepts here. There's Eretz HaTachteina and there's Eretz HaAlyena. Eretz HaTachteina means the physical world, and Eretz HaAlyena means Malchus of Atzilus, which is called Eretz HaChaim in Tanya, and it gets HaKedesh. And when you do a mitzvah down here, you're planting seeds in both Aratzes, physically and also in Eretz HaAlyena, and there's the harvest, this is what grows from both places. Pirush, and he explains it. Shekmei al derech mashal, using the physical analogy of planting something and having it grow. That we see, you plant a seed in the ground and then a tree grows. And from the tree you're going to have fruit. V'hinei, haperi, these fruit which come from these trees, which grew because of the seed that you planted, yesh beituv tam ve'enik, has incredibly good taste and pleasure, delight. Mashalehoya klal klal b'hagarin. The seed was bitter, tasteless, and the fruit which grows from the seed is delicious. The seed has no taste whatsoever. The question therefore is, when you plant a seed which is tasteless, how does it sprout? Valuable fruit, praiseworthy fruit, betuf tabera, so delicious, l'mayla, which is far beyond memhusa shalagara, from the substance of the seed itself. And of course, a biologist will tell you that fruit are the only living creature that's saying, please eat me, right? What are fruits in science and biology? Teda has a whole different idea. Scientists will tell you that fruits are colorful, and fruits are tasty, and fruits, as they say in biology, have no defenses. It's not like eating leaves, right? A fruit is saying, eat me. Why does a fruit want to be eaten? Because inside the fruit there's a seed, and when you eat the fruit, you eat the seed, and you take the seed someplace else, and it comes out in excrement, and then it germinates, and it grows, and there's a new tree. This is how fruits procreate. That's how trees procreate, by producing fruit, which are a sophisticated way of delivering seeds to the larger animals, which act in a similar way as pollinators do. They carry the seed someplace else and so on. That's the explanation in Chachmas for what fruit are. But the bottom line is the fruit is not what's going to make the new tree, it's the seed. The question is, the seed has no taste. So how does the seed, when it's been separated from the fruit, produce another tree which will produce fruit? This is the question. In the seed, l'chayra, there is no fruit itself. And he answers, the teretz is, the ikir tzmicha, you should know, because when the tree grows, and then this new tree, which came from a seed, produces fruit, and the fruit are going to be tasty, and now I want to flip to the Chassidus, right? In science, the whole point of a fruit is to create another tree. And in Chassidus, the whole point of a tree is to create a fruit which serves people. Because Chassidus doesn't see the web of light as a circle, as a cycle, where everything feeds everybody. Chassidus is the web of life as a line. Everything is ascending from mineral to plant to animal to man to God. So the whole purpose of a tree is that a person should eat a fruit and not just survive and be sustained, but should actually have pleasure. So the seed creates a new tree which produces fruit, which a pi Chassidus is going to feed a person. So where does the seed get the fruit if in the seed there's no taste? And the answer is because it's not from the seed. It's from, what does he say? It's in the earth. When you plant the seed, and the seed of course decomposes, it rots, and the rotted seed elicits, it evokes, it calls forward the power of life which exists in the earth, and the earth creates the new tree. According to Torah, the earth is like the woman, the feminine, the rechem, and the seed or the rain is the dchar, is the masculine. And it says in Ranat, which is a sort of a conclusion of the shailas and the sveikis which you have in Samach to Samach, in Nun Zayin, that the earth produces life. New life is created by the female, not by the male, and the male simply triggers it, stimulates it, arouses it. So the seed rots, and the earth produces the fruit. And the earth is an infinity. If life came from the seed alone, there wouldn't be fruit. But because the seed is not creating life, the seed is simply provoking the earth, and the earth is creating life, that's where the infinity is, that's where the fruit and its sweetness comes from. It goes back to the fact that the Eibishter said when he created the world that from the earth there's going to be grass, and from the earth there's going to be there's going to be trees that produce fruit. So Hashem spoke. What did he say? Hashem didn't say that there should be grass. Hashem didn't say there should be trees. Hashem said there should be a living earth that creates grass and trees. So when Hashem said there should be a living earth which create grass and trees, he didn't say it for 1 minute, he said it forever. So Hashem, by saying, Tachei ha'oretz deshe, and eitz eisepri, whatever the case is, eitz eisepri, he was giving into the earth this quality of creating life, of creating foodstuff, of creating plants. And when you plant a seed, your seed may be whatever it is, but the earth is being triggered, and the earth has the ability to create life that he got directly from the Eibishter. And therefore it's an infinite possibility. That power is not in the seed, it's in the ground. Moreover, it comes directly from the Eibishter, and therefore it's a divine power, it's a godly power. And it's lechadish, yesh meyayin, it creates newness, which is almost like creating something from where nothing existed. Lahoitzi kol min tzmicha, to produce sprout forth all kinds of living life, b'taimim shein, all kinds of tastes, v'chulu, and so on. Here it says lechadish yesh meyayin. Pardon me. In some place it's written, it's not yesh meyayin mamish, it's bedugmas yesh meyayin. I'm not going to go into it, but the point is, the infinity is not in the seed, the infinity is in the earth. Raksha mikomakim at the same time. And by the way, this mikomakim which you have now is going to be more relevant to the next shir, which we'll do next week. You have to plant. Even though the earth, Mother Earth as it's called, has the blessing of life, the Eibishter blessed the earth that life should come forward from it. And it's the blessing the Eibishter gave the earth, which is the basis for nourishment and for life and for taste and for pleasure and so on and so forth. You nevertheless need a seed to trigger it. There's no blessing without a vessel. Which the blessing is going to rest. So the bracha is the Eibishter's Maamar Tachei ha'oretz, and the keli is our effort of planting the seed. Like the Zayah says, the lays birchas nesharye b'atari kan yichuli, blessings will not manifest in an empty space. You plant the seed. It should be a vessel. Lishkein bei, to effect a manifesting in it. Light and life from the power of life which is in the earth. And how does this unfold? The seed decomposes, it rots. And it becomes theoretical. So the particular type of seed, typical tendency of the seed, stops being distinct and becomes a part of the earth, part of the infinity of life, the potential for life, which is in the earth. But because that seed rotted in that spot, the earth is going to produce a similar type of living tree. So that possibility to create life, which is in the earth, which is in the statement, let the ground, the earth, be blessed with all kinds of living forms. The seed triggers the earth. So you have to have a seed, but it's not the seed, it's the earth. What's the nimshal? And the nimshal is a mitzvah. When you and I do a mitzvah, begashmias, in Elam Hazeh, and we say that you need to tzerech aliyah, you're going from kadosh to kodesh, and it doesn't make any sense. And the answer is, don't you understand, the mitzvah we're doing is not creating kodesh. The mitzvah we're doing is planting a seed. And like I said earlier, it's an eretz ha'tachteina and an eretz ha'alyena, which is mechuveres keneged eretz ha'tachteina. This explains. Mitzvah. Here there's a physical mitzvah. Which is in physical things. Life should sprout. That the supernal holiness should be manifest. Says the Rebbe, it's not you, it's the When you're doing a mitzvah, you're planting a seed. And where are they being planted? In Israel, Be'eretz al-Yena, which you see he's mitzayin in the small type. He gets the Kedesh, Das, Eretz, Zdokis. In the Eretz al-Yena, which goes on Malchus of Atzilus, but there's also the Eretz al-Tachteina. So what you're doing is not reaching anything, but what you're doing is triggering Kedesh Elyon, which the Eibush to bless the earth with. And the earth is the lowest level. The Iz Bracha was given to the earth based on the principle of Na'atz Chalasam Asef. And look at the next words. Na'atz Chalasam Asef. And Hashem puts into the earth Ein Seif. Hanusha Be'eretz Al-Yena, the Malchus of Atzilus, which is the supernal earth. And correspondingly, Eretz HaTachteina, which is the physical earth, Mother Earth. Shenikra Eretz, Sefer the Koldagin, the lowest level. Na'atz, it's planted. Mitchilosan Mamish Nahayis Madrega. Bechinas Kedesh Alim V'chula, a level of holiness which is above all else. And of course, now's not a time to give long speeches about this, but this is the Igeres HaKedesh Siman Chaf, where the Alter Rebbe discusses Yesh Mayayin. That's the topic. And the Alter Rebbe asks, what's the process of Yesh Mayayin? And he gives two answers. The first half of the Igeres HaKedesh says the Yesh Mayayin comes from Oyer, Ein Me'ein Amor, so it has Atzmos. And the second half of the Igeres HaKedesh Siman Chaf says that Eretz Mayayin is in the earth, in the lowest level. Why? Because that's where Bittul is. In other words, in the first half of the Maimir, you have Atzmus in Eid because you're Davik in the Moir, because of your closeness. In the second half, in the lowest Madrega, you have Atzmus because of Bittul. You open yourself up to Atzmus. Be that as it may, in the earth, there is an infinite possibility for life, which the Eibishter blessed the earth with when he said, Tacha Oretz Desher, and it means Eretz HaTachtein and Eretz HaYena. So how is it that Neshama comes down here and there's a Yeridet Tzerech Aliyah? Because you're not creating the Kodesh, you're simply creating the seed. The power of creating life, which is Eretz HaYena. Latzmiach Gili Eretz HaYenim, to sprout forth the revelation of supernal light, and in this case Kodesh, which is higher than Kodesh, Ayidei Ma'aseh Mitzvah, the mitzvahs which we perform. Upirushen, it means, we're on line 137. Just like the physical earth, which is blessed with the power of creating life, is triggered by the seed, but the seed is only a trigger. The key is the earth. Sprouts with all kinds of pleasantries, as good taste, and so forth. Similarly, spiritually. When you do a mitzvah, you plant the seed in it, and it sprouts forth from not from your mitzvah, but from the earth which Hashem blessed. All types of revelations of supernal delight. You should have pleasure from the revelation of Eid Ein Sof until the Madrege of Kedesh, the essence of Eid Ein Sof. And the reward for this mitzvah, which brings to a Yid, and as he said earlier, it's really going to be revealed Lasset Lavi, and it's only a little bit through a bracha, which is revealed nowadays. The Madrega of Kedesh, it's attributable not to the mitzvah itself, but to the earth where the mitzvah is planted. When you're talking about levels of pleasure, it's like the same conversation of Kedesh and Kodesh, right? So you have Ha'ara Sa'enig and Etzamar. Even in Gan Eden, where the Einig is only a Ha'ara, the Gemara says, it's worth being judged. In order to get to Gan Eden, Shekidai, Kol Yisur Geyinim, all the suffering Geyinim is worthwhile to get to Gan Eden. I believe this is brought in the Rambanam and Sefer Iyv. That all 70 years of Geyinim is worth it to get to Gan Eden. Kolsh came Begila Shili Asid Lavi V'chuli, the revelation which is Asid Lavi, which is not only Ha'aras HaTainig, but Etzem HaTainig. It's not only Kodosh, but its Kodesh is certainly very delightful. Just as there's not going to be life sprouting forth from the earth, without planting a seed, and you'll see in the next year that the Alter Rebbe says different, that things can grow without being planted, but they won't have a high quality. Only when you plant, you have a high quality. The same is true of the supernal earth. The dafka, when you plant the seed, you have the revelation of Kedesh, which is Shalmai Mitzvahs. V'zeu shekosov, this is the pshat in the pasuk, ki ka'aretz teitzi tzmecha, v'chagana zerueha, tatzmiach, the earth and the garden produces life. But why does it produce life? Because shatzmicha l'mayla mayla mhus hazera zeruah bo, it's because you plant. But after you plant, the earth gives you much more than what the plant is, what the seeding is, because it's not your seed that's creating the life, it's the earth which is creating the life. And this is the explanation for the idea of Likutei Torah that you come to the Madrega of Kiddush, which is higher than Kaddish. It's really not your achievement. Your achievement is to create the seed and plant it. The Kiddush comes from the Yoretz. And we'll continue with Hashem in the next Shir.